The click of Alexandra's heels echoed across the marble floor, turning heads as she strode toward the boardroom. The youngest CEO in Solaris history never smiled. Not anymore. The sound of her heels stopped abruptly when Michael, the new maintenance man, stood to offer his seat. She glided past without acknowledgement. When he extended a cup of tea, she merely said, "Thank you, but I don't drink things from unknown sources." Behind those ice-cold eyes lay a universe that had collapsed long ago. Alexandra hadn't always been the woman they called the Ice Queen. Once, she was a 6-year-old with pigtails and wide dark eyes that sparkled with curiosity. Her small hands always clutched a sketchbook filled with colorful renderings of stars, planets, and cosmic wonders. Her father, a brilliant scientist, was the only one who truly understood the sensitive soul that lived within his daughter. Every afternoon, they would sit on the balcony of their modest apartment as he told her stories about the constellations. She would listen, mesmerized, then recreate the heavens with her colored wax crayons. Each night before bed, he would whisper the same words against her hair. "You are the brightest star in my sky." In those moments, Alexandra believed she could illuminate the entire universe. The connection between them was palpable, a silent language of shared wonder that needed no translation. Her mother would watch from the doorway, smiling at their ritual but never quite understanding the depth of their bond. It was as if father and daughter existed in their own galaxy, orbiting each other in perfect harmony. The day everything changed came without warning. A laboratory accident took her father when she was only 8 years old. The memory of her mother collapsing at the news was etched into Alexandra's mind, a woman once vibrant, now hollow and unable to function. Her grandmother arrived from the countryside to collect her, saying it would be better for everyone. Alexandra remembered the weight of her small suitcase, lighter than it should have been because she couldn't bear to pack her sketchbooks. The only treasure she brought was her father's pale blue handkerchief, which still carried the faint scent of his cologne and chalk dust from the laboratory. The drive to her grandmother's house stretched into infinity, each mile taking her further from the home where her father's voice still seemed to echo. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the car window, watching raindroplets race down the pane, imagining they were stars falling from their fixed positions in the universe. In her grandmother's home, Alexandra would bury her face in that handkerchief each night, soaking it with silent tears. Once, she overheard her grandmother speaking to a neighbor. "The girl needs to toughen up. Tears won't bring him back, or make her life any easier." After that, Alexandra learned to cry without making a sound. Eventually, she learned not to cry at all. Her grandmother wasn't cruel, simply practical, shaped by her own hardships. She provided structure, clean clothes, nutritious meals, and expectations of excellence. What she couldn't provide was the space for Alexandra's sensitive nature to flourish. The stars that once felt so close now seemed unreachable, locked behind a sky that had turned from velvet to concrete. In the garden behind her grandmother's house, Alexandra would sometimes lie on her back and search for constellations, but the stories her father had told her began to fade like old photographs left in the sun. By age 10, the sketchbooks were forgotten. By 14, she had become the top student in her school, with no friends and no extracurricular activities, just perfect grades and a perfect mask of indifference. At 18, she won a full scholarship to a prestigious university. By 25, she had graduated with an MBA at the top of her class and begun her meteoric rise through the corporate world. At 32, she became the youngest CEO in the history of Solaris Corporation, earning the nickname Ice Queen for her ruthless efficiency and emotional detachment. Along the way, she had methodically stripped away every vestige of the dreamy child she had once been. Her speeches at corporate events were legendary for their precision and lack of sentimentality. Employees admired her brilliance, but kept their distance, recognizing the invisible perimeter she maintained around herself. Alexandra had constructed her success like a fortress, impregnable, impressive, and utterly isolating. Alexandra's life became a perfectly constructed fortress. Her luxury apartment remained spotless and impersonal, like a museum exhibit of modern success. Relationships never lasted more than a few months. Men were attracted to her beauty and power but inevitably retreated from the impenetrable wall around her heart. In a locked glass cabinet in her bedroom closet, hidden behind designer shoes, lay the only item she had kept from her childhood. Her father's faded blue handkerchief, carefully preserved in a silk pouch. She rarely looked at it, but couldn't bear to throw it away. Sometimes, she had recurring nightmares where a small girl called to her from behind a mirror, but Alexandra always turned away, afraid of what she might see in that reflection. On particularly difficult nights, she would find herself standing before the cabinet, fingers hovering over the lock, before withdrawing without opening it. The handkerchief represented a vulnerability she could no longer afford, a reminder of the last time she had loved someone completely and lost them irrevocably. Better to succeed alone than to need anyone again. The first time Alexandra encountered Michael was in the executive elevator. At 40, he was shorter than average but solidly built, with a quiet strength in his movements. A small scar traced his right temple, and his eyes were calm and deep, like still water. Unlike other employees who averted their gaze or stared at their phones when she entered, Michael looked directly at her. His gaze wasn't challenging or inappropriate, just present. "Is there something you're looking at?" she asked sharply. Michael simply smiled, neither apologetic nor intimidated. "Good morning, Miss Reynolds," he replied, then returned to his thoughts. Alexandra found his composure unsettling. People feared her or wanted something from her. They didn't simply acknowledge her existence then move on with their day. In the boardroom later that morning, she found herself momentarily distracted, wondering about the scar on his temple and the unusual steadiness in his eyes. She dismissed the thought immediately. The maintenance staff's personal stories were irrelevant to the company's quarterly projections. Over the following weeks, Michael appeared at the periphery of her awareness with increasing frequency. When the office climate control system malfunctioned during a heat wave, he was the only maintenance staff member who could fix it, working through the night to restore comfort by morning. During a late board meeting, she returned to her office to find a cup of hot ginger tea on her desk. No note, no explanation. During an unexpected downpour, as she waited for her driver who was running late, Michael appeared with an umbrella, standing at a respectful distance in case she needed it. He never lingered for praise or gratitude, never seemed to expect recognition for these small acts of consideration. It was as though he performed these courtesies out of some internal compass, rather than for external validation. Alexandra found herself both irritated and intrigued by his behavior. It didn't fit into any pattern she recognized from her years of managing people. When she mentioned the maintenance man to her executive assistant, asking for his personnel file, she discovered he'd been hired 6 months ago with excellent references, but no explanation for why someone with his apparent capabilities would take such a modest position. At the annual company gala, Alexandra noticed Michael standing in a corner, observing the festivities with that same tranquil expression. When a clumsy board member accidentally spilled water on her silk dress, Michael materialized with a pale blue handkerchief. "This might help," he said, offering it with an open palm. "I don't use other people's personal items," she replied coldly, turning away to find a bathroom instead. But in the brief moment their eyes met, she saw no hurt in his expression, only a deep understanding that unnerved her. That night, Alexandra dreamed of her father, and a blue handkerchief floating on a starlit breeze. She woke with a start, heart pounding, feeling as though someone had opened a door inside her that had been locked for decades. The dream clung to her throughout the morning, making it difficult to focus on the acquisition proposal on her desk. Twice, her assistant had to repeat questions, something that had never happened before. The coincidence of the blue handkerchief troubled her more than she cared to admit. It was just a common accessory, she told herself, nothing magical or significant about it. Yet the color, that specific shade of pale blue, had stirred something she thought had been permanently laid to rest. In the days that followed, Alexandra found herself noticing things about Michael she had previously overlooked. During his lunch breaks, he would sit on a bench in the corporate garden, reading worn paperback classics. She glimpsed titles by Steinbeck, Bradbury, and Hesse in his hands. He brought homemade lunches in simple containers, nothing elaborate, but evidently prepared with care. Once a week, he shared his meal with Doris, the elderly cleaning woman, listening patiently as she showed him photos of her grandchildren on her outdated phone. One afternoon, Alexandra passed a conference room and glimpsed Michael showing the accounting manager's son how to create an intricate paper model of a spacecraft. The boy's face was alight with concentration and joy, while Michael guided his small hands with infinite patience. Something about the scene made Alexandra linger longer than she should have. The gentleness in his weathered hands, the focus in his expression, it awakened an ache for something she couldn't name. Curiosity led her to pass by the small maintenance office where Michael worked. The space was immaculate, with tools arranged with precision. On his desk sat a single picture frame, placed face down. The mystery of that hidden photograph nagged at her for reasons she couldn't articulate. Who was this man who seemed so contained, so complete in himself? What was he hiding or protecting by turning that frame away from the world? She found herself creating scenarios in her mind, perhaps a lost love, a family estrangement, a painful memory. Then she would catch herself, irritated by this pointless speculation. Michael was an employee, nothing more. His private life was his own affair. Yet the question lingered, a small pebble in the shoe of her otherwise orderly thoughts. It was a Saturday when everything changed. Alexandra was shopping at an upscale mall, seeking a gift for a business associate. As she exited a boutique, she heard a child crying. Amid the weekend crowd, a little girl with pigtails stood alone, tears streaming down her face. People hurried past, too absorbed in their own activities to notice. Alexandra felt her heart rate accelerate. The girl looked about 6 years old, the same age she had been when her world was whole and safe. The child's distress resonated with something deep inside her, yet Alexandra found herself frozen, unable to approach or comfort the girl. Her designer shoes might as well have been set in concrete. She wanted to move forward, to kneel down and ask the child what was wrong, but an invisible barrier held her back. The noise of the mall seemed to fade as she stood transfixed, caught between the imperative to help and her own emotional paralysis. "Excuse me." The familiar voice came from behind her. Michael stood there, holding a simple shopping bag. He didn't seem surprised to see Alexandra, merely nodding in acknowledgement before moving toward the crying child. Alexandra watched, rooted to the spot, as he approached without haste, kneeling to meet the little girl at eye level. From his pocket, he produced the same pale blue handkerchief. Alexandra had refused at the gala. With gentle movements, Michael wiped the tears from the child's cheeks, speaking in a low, soothing voice that Alexandra couldn't hear from where she stood. Whatever he said made the girl's sobs subside, replaced by small nods. From his other pocket, he retrieved a small wrapped candy, which brought a tentative smile to the child's face. Then, holding her tiny hand, he guided her toward the information desk. Throughout this interaction, Alexandra couldn't move, couldn't look away. The scene before her created a strange doubling effect in her mind, as though she were watching her 8-year-old self receiving the comfort she had never gotten. The tenderness of his actions, the natural way he connected with the child's distress, it struck a chord so deep within her that she felt physically unbalanced, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly tilted. When Michael returned, he found Alexandra still standing there, silent, with reddened eyes. Without words, they walked together out of the shopping center. The late afternoon sun cast their elongated shadows across the pavement as they emerged into the open air. They stood side by side, watching the light reflect off the glass facades of surrounding buildings. "Sometimes," Michael said softly, breaking the silence, "we don't know what to do with other people's pain because we've never learned how to handle our own." His words seemed to hang in the air between them, neither accusation nor advice, simply truth. Alexandra didn't respond, but for the first time in her adult life, she felt truly seen, not as the accomplished CEO, not as the ice queen, but as the wounded child, who had never learned how to comfort or be comforted. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating, like stepping off a cliff only to discover you could fly. They found themselves in a small coffee shop several blocks away, warm yellow light creating a cocoon of privacy around their corner table. Soft piano music played in the background. For the first time, they were not CEO and maintenance worker, just two people sitting across from each other with steaming mugs between them. Alexandra's usual poise seemed to have abandoned her. She cradled her cup in both hands as if drawing warmth from it, her normally perfect posture softening into something more human. "Why did you help that little girl?" she finally asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding edge. Michael looked into his coffee before answering. "Because I once saw my daughter in the same situation." His response was simple but heavy with implication. The sentence landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that touched places Alexandra had long ago sealed off. Alexandra's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't know you had a daughter." Her words came out softer than intended, as if someone else were speaking through her. "Sophie," he said, the name emerging with both love and sorrow. "She was 6 when she was diagnosed." Michael told her how he had once been an electronics engineer with a promising career at a leading tech firm. How his wife couldn't handle the diagnosis and left shortly after, unable to face the reality of a terminally ill child. How he had abandoned his professional trajectory to care for Sophie full-time during her treatments. As he spoke, Alexandra noticed the subtle lines around his eyes, the way his hands, capable and strong, moved with deliberate gentleness. She realized that the quiet dignity she had observed in him came from someone who had faced the worst life could offer and somehow remained whole. In the hospital, Sophie would sometimes wander. The corridors were long and confusing, and she'd become disoriented and frightened. His voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened around his mug. No one seemed to see her fear. Nurses and doctors were busy, visitors were focused on their own loved ones. Until one day, a young volunteer nurse found her. As Michael continued his story, Alexandra felt a strange vibration in her chest, like a tuning fork struck against stone. Something about his narrative was beginning to resonate with her own memories, creating a harmonic that was both painful and compelling. The nurse didn't say anything. She just took out a pale blue handkerchief and gently wiped Sophie's tears away. Alexandra's coffee grew cold as Michael spoke, describing how the nurse had embraced his daughter, crying with her, not from pity, but from a place of genuine empathy. She held Sophie as though she understood exactly what it meant to be small and lost and afraid. Sophie loved stars, Michael said, his eyes now fixed on some point beyond the cafe walls. And this nurse would tell her stories about constellations during her treatments. Stories about how the stars were actually souls watching over us. A strange tingling sensation began at the base of Alexandra's spine. 15 years ago, before business school, she had volunteered at the Children's Hospital for a single summer. It had been her private pilgrimage, a way to honor her father by offering comfort where she could. She remembered the little girl with curious eyes who would light up at her star stories. A girl whose name she had forgotten over the years, but whose brave smile had stayed with her. She told Sophie that the North Star was special because it always showed the way home, even when you felt completely lost. Michael continued. That no matter how dark the night got, the stars were constant companions. Alexandra's hands began to tremble. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the details were too specific to be chance. The star stories, the blue handkerchief, they were hers. Sophie's last month was her happiest. Michael continued, because of that blue handkerchief, and the star stories from the volunteer nurse. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a carefully folded square of fabric, the pale blue handkerchief, now worn thin with age. After Sophie passed, I kept this. But eventually, I realized it should return to the person who had brought light into my daughter's final days. Alexandra stared at the handkerchief, recognition flooding her. The delicate embroidered initials in the corner, R.S., Robert Sinclair, her father's name. The handkerchief she had given to a dying child in a moment of pure empathy, before she had learned to lock away such dangerous emotions. The last piece of her father she had ever possessed, freely given because in that moment, a child's comfort had mattered more than her own. I started working at Solaris because I recognized you in a business magazine profile, Michael said quietly. You were the volunteer nurse who sat with Sophie. But your eyes were different in person, as though the girl who had shown such compassion to my daughter had vanished, just as Sophie had. Alexandra felt something crack inside her chest, a wall that had stood for 15 years, suddenly developing fissures. Her vision blurred with tears she couldn't control. For the first time since her father's funeral, she cried openly, shoulders shaking with the release of long-suppressed grief. Between sobs, she told Michael about her father. About the handkerchief he had given her days before the accident, his favorite, which she had carried everywhere. How she had volunteered at the hospital searching for some connection to him, some way to honor his memory. And how, after that summer, she had buried the compassionate, creative child within her to become the perfect, controlled success her grandmother and society expected. I remember giving my handkerchief to a little girl, she whispered. I never knew what happened to her. Or to it. The coincidence seemed too immense to comprehend. That this man had carried a piece of her father, a piece of her true self, all these years, only to return to her life when she had forgotten who she once was. Michael's hand rested on the table between them, not reaching for hers, but offering a presence that anchored her as emotions swept through her body like a tsunami. Sophie changed me, he said simply. She taught me that there is nothing stronger than gentleness. Nothing more courageous than remaining open after loss. His words weren't meant as a lesson or judgment, but Alexandra heard in them an alternative to the path she had chosen, another way to honor what had been lost. As night fell outside the cafe windows, two strangers became two people who had been connected by invisible threads of loss and remembrance. Their conversation continued until the cafe staff began stacking chairs, neither wanting to break the fragile bridge that had formed between them. They talked about Sophie's favorite books, about Alexandra's father's research on stellar phenomena, about the strange geometry of grief that had shaped them both in different ways. For hours, the carefully constructed CEO fell away, and Alexandra spoke from a place she had almost forgotten existed. Authentic, unguarded, alive with both pain and wonder. When they finally left the cafe, standing under a sky, now dotted with stars, there was a tentative quality to their goodbye, as if neither was quite sure what had transpired between them or what it meant for tomorrow. On Monday morning, Alexandra entered Solaris headquarters with the same confident stride. Her wardrobe was still impeccable, her posture still straight as a ruler. But attentive observers might have noticed subtle differences. When the marketing director presented a proposal, Alexandra didn't merely listen for flaws, she truly heard the enthusiasm behind the ideas. During budget meetings, she asked questions that went beyond numbers to the people those decisions would affect. The ice in her gaze had thawed into something quieter, like a lake after a storm, still deep but no longer frozen. When her executive assistant made an error in scheduling, Alexandra didn't deliver her usual cutting remark but simply asked her to fix it, adding, "We all have off days." The assistant nearly dropped her tablet in shock. Her executive assistant noticed that a small frame had appeared on Alexandra's desk, containing a child's drawing of stars and planets, signed with a child's uneven script. When asked about it, Alexandra simply said it was a treasure from long ago. Colleagues whispered about the changes, creating theories ranging from therapy to romance, but no one guessed the truth, that Alexandra had simply remembered the person she had been before the armor became her skin. In meetings, she began asking different questions. Not just about profit margins and market share, but about the company's impact on employees' lives, about sustainability, about creating products that genuinely improved people's experiences. Her leadership style remained decisive and clear, but it had acquired a new dimension, a willingness to consider the human element in business decisions. On weekends, Alexandra began volunteering at the Children's Hospital again. She would sit by beds reading stories about brave explorers and magical realms, her voice taking on the different characters with a theatricality that surprised even herself. She brought art supplies and encouraged the children to draw their dreams, their fears, their hopes, creating safe spaces for their emotions through creativity, just as her father had done for her. Sometimes, after these sessions, she would find herself standing in front of the observatory her father had loved, looking up at the same stars they had named together. The pain of his loss remained, but it had transformed from a jagged wound into something more like a sacred scar, a mark of love that had changed but never diminished. Sometimes, passing the small maintenance office, she would glimpse Michael's desk, where the previously face-down photograph now stood upright, a smiling little girl with her father's eyes, holding a toy telescope. They didn't date or grow particularly close in the conventional sense. Alexandra and Michael remained professional at work, nodding in acknowledgement when their paths crossed. But there was an understanding between them, a recognition that transcended ordinary relationships. They were two souls who had witnessed each other's deepest wounds and recognized the same constellations in each other's skies. Occasionally, they would exchange books. She lending him biographies of pioneering women scientists, he sharing dog-eared copies of poetry collections that had sustained him through dark nights. On the last day before the holiday break, the office was nearly empty. Alexandra walked past the maintenance room, where Michael sat reading Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. She placed a small gift box on his desk without ceremony. Inside was the pale blue handkerchief, now carefully cleaned and pressed. "Keep it," she said softly. "I think Sophie and my father would both be happy knowing it connected us." Her voice held no flirtation or expectation, only the quiet certainty of returning something to its rightful place in the universe. Michael looked at the handkerchief, then at Alexandra, a smile of understanding passing between them. "Thank you," he said simply, accepting both the gift and its meaning. Some objects carry more than their physical presence. They become vessels for memory, for connection, for the invisible threads that bind human hearts across time and space. That evening, as Alexandra left the building, she paused to look up at the winter sky, where stars punctured the darkness with ancient light. "I'm still your brightest star," she whispered to the heavens, a private message to a father long gone but somehow still present. The words were both a child's promise and a woman's declaration, an integration of who she had been and who she had become. Her phone chimed with a text message from Michael. "There's a story hour at the Children's Hospital this weekend. If you're not busy." Alexandra smiled, not the practiced smile of a corporate executive, but the genuine expression of someone who had discovered a pathway back to herself. What existed between them wasn't romantic love, but something equally powerful, the possibility of healing. The little girl inside Alexandra had finally been seen, not to replace the strong woman she had become, but to reunite with her, making her whole in a way she hadn't been for decades. As she walked to her car, Alexandra felt lighter than she had in years. The path ahead wasn't about changing everything, but about integration. Bringing together the child who loved stars with the woman who commanded boardrooms. For the first time since she was 8 years old, Alexandra felt the exhilarating possibility that she could be both strong and soft, powerful and vulnerable. A complete constellation rather than a single, isolated star. The handkerchief had found its way home through a circuitous journey of loss and rediscovery. And in that journey, Alexandra had found something she thought was gone forever, not just memories of her father or echoes of her childhood self, but the courage to feel deeply in a world that often rewards those who feel nothing at all. As winter stars glimmered overhead, Alexandra realized that sometimes, rejection isn't the end of a story but the beginning, that sometimes, the people we push away are precisely the ones who can lead us back to the parts of ourselves we've lost along the way.